Today is September 27th. I made a post a little bit earlier this morning regarding CPS, and I felt it was important to preface what CPS is about, and when it was funded, when the organization started, and some of the politics surrounding it, before I explain what they did with me. And I feel that it's relevant because it shows why CPS as an organization would have individuals working for them that would be part of an attempt to include my son into government research, which is what they did with me when I was a child, and which is what they've done with me my entire life. As I've described in other clips, there's documentation that shows records were supposedly destroyed. There's a file that was destroyed about me in 1977, which was 4 months after the MK Ultra hearings were held at the Senate. And most likely, I got that information from the FBI, and I posted it online. The letter that I received from the FBI, I posted that online in a photo, and then I also showed the front part of it in one of my video clips. The idea that that file was destroyed is possibly incorrect, or the claim that the file was destroyed is possibly incorrect. The government is typically very reluctant to destroy materials that they feel are important, even if they are concerned that there is some kind of a hearing that is going to be conducted. So while many MK Ultra files were destroyed and documents were destroyed in anticipation of that hearing and around that time, I believe that probably that it was a lie, that some of those documents were not destroyed, they were just moved, or they were copied, sent to another location, and then maybe the original documents were destroyed. However, I do think that documentation exists because the United States has been extremely careful in not destroying any kind of research and documentation. They began their research programs on U.S. citizens approximately around the time that they escorted a bunch of Nazi scientists from Germany to the United States to work for the CIA. And that's not my conspiracy theory, that's a fact. Anyone who has read history or who looks that up online can check that fact. So while there were some scientists that went to the Nuremberg trials and were punished for war crimes, there were also some scientists that went to different countries like Chile or Argentina. Argentina was a popular place to go for some reason. And then the United States actually gave, I forgot the word for it, but basically when you give them you give somebody a pardon in exchange for their services or their work. So the United States escorted some of the German scientists over to this country because they felt the documentation and evidence that they had collected in some of their human experimentation was valuable or could be used for research and for medical reasons and sociological reasons in the future. And they were already coming up with different kinds of intelligence programs that involve science and incorporated science. So when the Nazis destroyed a lot of their records, the United States was very interested in preserving whatever they could and getting that documentation over to this country. And I do not believe that the United States would spend money to host Nazi scientists that experimented on humans and would be so careful to make sure that they could retrieve any kind of documentation and records that existed, and then they would just arbitrarily start destroying records that they were making to record their research of their own citizens later. So it is probably a decoy to convince people to not believe that there is any kind of evidence existing, and to discourage people from trying to figure out where that evidence might be contained. So the fact that my family, my parents have been used for government research and been forced into that kind of a program, and then the fact that then the next generation was forced into that kind of a program, it's very suggestive that then my son was targeted to be part of the same thing. And it's typically a generational thing. The United States government picks one family, or picks more than one family, but picks a family, and they usually stay with that family because once they condition one generation, then it's easier to get to the second one by blackmail or through the conditioning they've already done. And it's easier for them. So when CPS was telling me to, or when I was trying to see my son and show up for visits, CPS told me that they didn't have a bus scheduled. It didn't take that long to schedule a bus for me to go from Birch Bay to Wenatchee, and I had a right to stay in Birch Bay. It wasn't required for me to be in that town. And it was required for that state to provide the transportation. It's a legal requirement for the state to provide the transportation and to provide the funding for any kind of transportation to visits. And they are required by law to schedule those visits to preserve the parental bond. The reason why that funding is provided by CPS is because if it's their requirement, and if they're the party that's responsible for removing a child, they are also responsible for any costs associated with any kind of litigation, services, or anything having to do with that quote-unquote case. So what I found out is that after they removed my son from me, they had a protective order ready and waiting to apply to my son when he came across the border. So what occurred is that the entire 2 weeks that I was in Canada, Canadian immigration basically just had me sitting in with their own government, people from their own government, from the FBI, because it's not as if, I mean, the FBI has their own agents that sit right across the border and pretend to be Canadians, just as the Canadians have people who sit across the border and live in Blaine and pretend to be Americans or visiting tourists. So it took, because the United States did not have any case started against me, they then tried to get documents together during that 2-week period of time when I was in Canada, and they started up their case after we had already left the country. So they had no jurisdiction to even start a CPS case when we had left. We were no longer citizens of the United States or part of the United States and within that jurisdiction. And I had my son's Social Security number removed from him, and the state had no governance over my son at that point. Actually, the federal government did not. My son would have been considered to be possibly a citizen of Washington, and since he was born in the United States, he was a citizen of the United States, but he didn't have the kind of connectual nexus that's required for the government to even try to do what they did, especially when we were out of their territory. So basically that 2 weeks' time was used as an attempt to stall and allow CPS and the United States to lie about me and put together fraudulent documents to make it look like they had a case put together, so that when they then set me up for a false arrest, they had documents ready to go. Because they did not have any of those documents when we left, and it took them some time to to put them all together, come up with enough lies, and then go to the courthouse, get a judge to issue the protective order, and then they had to wait on Canada to set me up, to arrest me, so that then they had an excuse to take my son. So that's what CPS was involved in to start with. And also CPS is required by law, there's a law that states CPS cannot remove a child for any reason without first exhausting all remedies, all available other remedies. So if they have any concern about a child for any reason, they are required to offer services while the child is still with the parent. I mean, unless there's a physical harm, or evidence of physical harm on that child. They are required to offer, drug counseling, mental health counseling, anything along those lines first, before taking the drastic step of removing and separating a child from their parent. And that is a law. It's something that CPS cannot sidestep, and they did. So aside from committing the crimes that they committed, and colluding to commit this crime of trying to kidnap my son for me, they then committed a crime of, well, it's probably not a crime, but they broke their own rule and law of exhausting all remedies first. And at that time, according to the report, the only thing that they had was supposedly a dirty house, and I read the report, and the report was full of lies. So the entire report was full of lies. They included, actually, also, they included every single one of the unfounded complaints that had been thrown out because I was able to provide evidence that they were not true. All of those things that were not true, that I provided evidence for and cleared myself of, they tried to squeeze into the same report and make it look like there was this ongoing investigation for each one of those complaints. And they did not discard them as they were discarded. So basically it made it look like there was complaint after complaint, and it was all part of an investigation that went back a ways, and that's not the case. Once something is dismissed as unfounded and there's evidence to prove it's unfounded, it's thrown out. It doesn't become part of a running history. So I think that they tried to make it look like it was an ongoing investigation, because there was no ongoing investigation at all at the time that we left, and they wanted to have an excuse as to why they were coming after us and harassing us. So that's the motive that the United States and CPS and Canada had for letting me live in Canada for a little while, until it looked like both sides got some of their ducks in a row. So they came up with what looked like legal reasons and excuses to have my son taken away from me. And the fact is, it was premeditated. All of it was premeditated. And that makes it a premeditated crime. Once I was in Birch Bay, I was trying to get, and in Blaine, I was trying to get visitation of my son. And they are required to provide the transportation for that. And scheduling a trip on a Greyhound doesn't take very long, and it never does with CPS. They already have that contract in place. So they refused to do it. And then when they did schedule the bus, they told me, I sent them an email telling them that I was in a small town and it would take 30 minutes for me to get to the station, so please give me a day notice, 24 hours notice ahead of time, so that I could be sure I knew when the bus was going to arrive, and I could make sure I had a ride, had somebody to take me there and be there on time. And what CPS did, probably 3 or 4 times in a row, is I was told by Marie Scanlon, who was the assigned social worker at the time, and she was working with Michelle Erickson as well. But Marie Scanlon's name was the contact that I had at the time. So Marie Scanlon, who's married to Justin, or who is friends with Justin Titus's wife, who later became, Justin Titus later became my public defender, which is a total conflict of interest. But Marie Scanlon was sending me email telling me